Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy and specifically to talk about Russian shipping, because two Russian oil tankers recently sank off the coast of Russia. And the reason why they sank is because both of them were more than 50 years old. They are old and decrepit. And this is really a reflection of the fact that Russia is struggling to be able to have enough cash to be able to replace all of its ships. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll be aware that the West has applied sanctions directly against Russian shipping, and it's been applying a price cap on Russian oil. And the way that price cap is operated is through the ownership and insurance of the ships. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, the vast majority of Russian oil was being transported using ships either owned or insured by the West. And so in order to reduce the amount of revenue that Russia is receiving from those shipments, the West applied a price cap of $60 per barrel for all crude oil and around $100 per barrel for refined oil products. And the way that that's operated is that the owners of the ships have to see documentation that proves that the deal that's been struck to sell that Russian oil has not been done above that price. And if it is, then they will not allow that shipment to be processed. And in terms of insurance, any ship needs to have insurance to dock into a major port around the world, because obviously if it crashes into that port and sinks and creates a massive oil slick, you need somebody to be able to pay for the repair of all of that. And those insurance companies have been following exactly the same rules. They need to see documentation that proves that the oil that's being transported is below the price cap. Now, in order to get around that, Russia has been using a combination of its own ships, and this is why it's using older and older vessels that historically would have been sent to the scrapyard and broken up and then melted down and made into something else. And also what's called the grey and the dark fleet. Now, the grey fleet is a group of ships that are operating sort of illegally. They're registered in various countries around the world, and they're moving shipments of Russian oil. And the dark fleet is basically ships that are not being monitored. So they're turning their transponders off. They're difficult to track. They're not flying under any official flights. And it's difficult to be able to control the movement of that oil through the price caps. Now, in terms of answering the question, how long does an oil tanker last for? What's its expected life? This chart shows the average age of the global oil tanker fleet between 2018 and 2023. And what this shows is that over the past 5 years, the average age has been increasing from just over 18.5 years in 2018 to just above 20 years in 2023. The life expectancy of an oil tanker varies depending on how it's been constructed, the waters that it's sailing through, and how well it's being maintained. An oil tanker can either be single-skinned or double-skinned, and double-skinned lasts longer. It's expected that a single skin would have a life expectancy of somewhere between 15 and 20 years. However, double-skinned can be between 20 and 30 years. If it's constantly sailing through stormy waters, then that can also reduce the life expectancy. And repair and maintenance also has a big factor. If you're constantly repairing your ship and keeping it well maintained, it's likely to last longer. If you're not, then obviously it won't. It's exactly the same as your car. If you look after it, then it's likely to be able to last you longer. If you don't do any maintenance, you don't do any servicing, you don't change the tyres, then it's likely that you're going to get into trouble with it. However, in a recent report, Clarkson's, the shipping consultants, said that once a ship moves past 30 years, it's likely that the cost of repair and maintenance will exceed the profit that that ship can generate, and therefore it becomes uneconomical and should be scrapped. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Incogni. Something that drives me absolutely insane is spam marketing, whether it be spam emails or spam text messages, or the very worst of all, spam phone calls, where people phone you up and try to sell you things that you've got absolutely no interest in buying. Now, the reason why you're hit with so much spam these days is because of data brokers. And this is a huge industry now. Data brokers can take your data when you go online and register for a store card or buy something, and then they can sell your data onto hundreds of different databases. And those databases are then used to hit you with all of the spam. Now, the great news is that if you can find out which databases you're on, you can contact them and have your details deleted. But who's got time to be doing that? Well, the answer to that question is incogni. Once you sign up with them, they will contact the data brokers and ask for your data to be removed. And as well as cutting out all of those unsolicited phone calls and messages, it will also protect you from cybercrime and identity theft. And the fantastic news is that Joe Blog's viewers can get a 60% discount on an annual plan by clicking on the link in the description below. Now, the two Russian oil tankers that sank recently in the Kerch Strait, one was constructed in 1969, making it 55 years old, and the other was constructed in 1973, meaning it was 51 years old. So both these vessels were more than 20 years older than Clarkson is saying is economically viable to keep these ships operating. And that really raises the question as to why Russia was continuing to use them. And realistically, the answer was because Russia couldn't afford to buy replacement vessels, because it's obviously very expensive to buy a whole new ship. And so they were still running them, even though they were beyond their useful and economic life. And obviously that raises the risk of these ships sinking, and that's exactly what happened in stormy waters recently. And both of those ships were carrying in the region of 30,000 barrels of oil each, which isn't a lot in terms of some of the massive vessels that can carry 1 million barrels of oil. But in terms of the environmental damage, 30,000 barrels of oil is still a huge amount of oil to clean up from the sea. And so that's going to create a major problem for the next few months, potentially years. As I mentioned at the start of today's video, a lot of Russian oil is now being moved using what's called the grey and the dark fleets. So basically, these are unauthorised vessels that are moving Russian oil not complying with the price caps. This chart shows the volume of oil being moved every single day using the dark and grey fleets. And we've got two different coloured lines on this chart. The black line shows the volume of crude oil being transported, and the orange line shows the volume of refined oil products. And what you can see from this chart is that Russia has been using the dark and grey fleets for a long period of time, at least 12 months before the invasion of Ukraine. However, since the invasion of Ukraine, the amount of oil being transported has increased significantly. At the time of the invasion, around 700,000 barrels of crude oil per day and 1 million barrels of refined oil were being transported using the dark and grey fleets. However, as a direct result of the sanctions being applied against Russian oil, there was an increase in the usage of these vessels. And by February 2024, 2 years after the invasion commenced, Russia was transporting 2.1 million barrels of crude oil per day and 1.9 million barrels of refined oil products. So in total, 4 million barrels of Russian oil were being transported every single day using the dark and grey fleets. So that represents an increase of more than 100% over the 2-year period. This chart shows the age distribution of both the grey fleet and the dark fleet. The scale on the left-hand side is a percentage and goes from 0 at the bottom to 100 at the top. And the 4 different coloured sections we've got here. The blue section at the bottom are ships that are less than 5 years old. The green section represents ships that are between 5 and 10 years old, the yellow section between 10 and 15 years old, and the orange section at the top represents ships more than 15 years old. And what you can see very clearly from these two charts is that the vast majority of all of the ships being used by the grey and the dark fleet are more than 15 years old. The percentage of older vessels is around 72% for the grey fleet and 68% for the dark fleet. And in terms of where those vessels are delivering Russian oil, this chart shows the top 10 destinations for the grey fleet, and you can see that the largest by far is India, followed by China, Turkey, Singapore, Brazil, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, Libya, and Taiwan. And for the dark fleet, the biggest single destination is China, followed by India, Turkey, Singapore, Bulgaria, United Arab Emirates, Brazil, South Korea, the Netherlands, and Malaysia. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think it's really interesting that Russia is using extremely old vessels to move its oil. The two that we've talked about in today's video are more than 50 years old, and both of them sank in stormy waters. Now, clearly, whenever there's an environmental disaster, that is something that is a complete nightmare for everybody. Oil is very difficult to be able to remove from the ocean, and obviously it has a devastating impact on all of the wildlife, any beaches, any areas of water that it actually comes into contact with. So this is something that takes a lot of time to clear up and is very expensive. And one of the reasons why the price caps were applied against Russian oil was to prevent the unauthorised movement of Russian oil using ships that are dangerous. But unfortunately, the consequence of applying those price caps is that there has been a huge increase in the movement of oil using the grey and dark fleets. And as we saw from the graphic earlier, those fleets are predominantly older vessels. These are vessels that may have been taken out of service by some of the big shipping companies. They've been purchased rather than being scrapped and are now being run by other countries. But the problem that you have if you're running an old vessel is that firstly, it's very expensive because you're having to do a lot of repairs and maintenance. And secondly, it's dangerous. It potentially could sink. And if it does sink, you've got a big insurance problem. Now, the insurance companies from the West, who before the invasion of Ukraine were covering over 90% of all of the oil that was being shipped, will not cover these sort of vessels. So Russia has stepped in and is providing its own insurance for a lot of these different grey and dark fleets. And the problem that Russia has now is that it's going to have a huge insurance claim. It's going to have to clean up the waters in the Kerch Strait. So the Russian insurance businesses that have applied all of that insurance are now going to have to pick up the cost. And also, Russia's lost 2 of its tankers, and it doesn't have the money to be able to replace it with new fleet. So this is proving a big problem from Russia's point of view. And one of the reasons that I wanted to post this video is that I'm constantly being hit with comments from people saying, what are you talking about? The Russian economy is doing really well. It's one of the strongest economies in the world. But the fact that Russia is being forced to use vessels that are more than 50 years old, more than 20 years older than Clarkson said were economically viable to run, that tells you that there are problems in the Russian economy right now, because oil is one of the biggest industries in Russia. It's the lifeblood of the economy. It needs to keep that oil moving. And the fact that it's using uneconomic vessels and dangerous vessels tells you that there are serious issues happening in Russia right now. So the overall summary of today's video is that the 2 ships that sunk recently off the coast of Russia were over 50 years old. They should have been broken up, melted down and used for something else. However, Russia has been forced to keep using these older vessels because it can't afford to replace them with new vessels. That's raising the risk of these vessels sinking. They have done off the Kerch Strait. There is now a huge environmental cleanup job needed to be paid for. Russian insurance businesses are going to have to pick up that cost. And if this continues, if we continue to see these really old and decrepit vessels being used to move Russian oil, it's likely that more of these disasters will occur. That's going to raise the costs for those insurance companies, put further pressure onto the Russian economy. And overall, it tells you that there are serious issues both in the Russian economy and also in the Russian oil industry right now. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.